The engineering station hummed at a frequency Deka had learned to read like a pulse. Steady meant nominal. A warble in the upper register meant the portside thermal exchanger was cycling heavy. A low throb meant the reactor was hungry and the fuel feed algorithms were doing that thing where they argued with themselves for 6 seconds before agreeing on a flow rate. Right now, steady. The ship was breathing easy. She checked her internal clock, the one she'd been keeping since day one, counting off hours by habit, because the Combine didn't believe in circadian rhythm, and the ship's lighting never changed. The overhead panels held that constant sodium orange, the same flat industrial glow, whether it was the middle of a watch or the dead hours between them. No dimming, no warming toward amber in the evening the way the light in her apartment in Nairobi had shifted when the sun dropped behind the Nyung Hills, just the same relentless output, hour after hour, as if the Combine had looked at the concept of day and night and decided it was an inefficiency. 18 hours since her last sleep cycle, 6 hours since the last watch rotation, approximately 0300 ship time by the consensus clock the tall commander had established for the watch schedule. The bridge was empty except for her. The watch rotation said it shouldn't be. The scarred one and one of the freed species were supposed to be on until 0600, but the scarred one had been nursing a pulled muscle in his left shoulder for 2 days, and she'd sent him to the medical bay an hour ago. He resisted the way he always resisted anything that required him to admit his body had limitations, standing at his station with his left arm held slightly away from his side, as if the shoulder would fix itself if he just refused to acknowledge it loudly enough. She pointed at the door. It had gone. The freed species had followed, because the freed species followed the scarred one everywhere now, which was either loyalty or the fact that he was warm-blooded and they were cold-blooded, and he radiated heat like a ceramic stove. So, alone, the transponder interface glowed on her secondary display. She'd had it open for 3 days. She hadn't been working on it, just looking at it. The way you look at a door you know you're going to walk through but haven't decided when. The cursor blinked steadily in its empty field, patient as a machine could be, which was to say infinitely patient, because patience implied awareness of time passing, and the cursor was not aware of anything. It just blinked. On, off, on, off. It had been doing that for 72 hours, and it would do it for 72 more and 72 after that, and it would never once wonder why the field was still empty. I have been calling the ship for 8 days. That was fine while we were running from something. We are going towards something now. It should have a name before we arrive anywhere. The process itself was simple. The captain, who was still technically alive and technically on the bridge during daylight hours, sitting at his former station with the energy of a man who had been asked to train his replacement and understood that his severance package was not being killed, had walked her through it on day 3. He'd done it with the meticulous cooperation of someone who had precisely calculated the survival value of being useful and the survival cost of being difficult, and had decided to be useful with such thoroughness that it occasionally circled back around to a kind of passive aggression. Authorization codes? She had those pulled from the bridge lockout override during the takeover. Registration matrix, a template system designed so that any Combine dock officer could update a ship's identity without understanding the underlying architecture. Broadcast configuration, 3 fields, registry number, classification, name, the registry number she'd already changed. The old one, a string of Combine alphanumerics that translated roughly to harvester class freight, regional assignment, sub-tier biological transport, was gone, replaced with a number she generated from the ship's own reactor signature. It would read as legitimate to any automated system. It would not match anything in any Combine database. That was the point. The classification she changed to independent trader. Independent traders were the background noise of Combine space, thousands of them, mostly automated, mostly beneath notice. The Combine didn't track them individually, they tracked them statistically. One more blip in the statistical noise was invisible. One fewer harvest ship in the regional fleet was a paperwork problem someone would eventually notice, but not today, and not tomorrow, and probably not for another 30 days, because the Combine's asset reconciliation cycle ran monthly, and the ship had been due for a maintenance rotation anyway. She'd learned that from the captain. He told her with the flat affect of a man explaining how his own house could be burgled. She thanked him. He'd stared at her like gratitude was a system error. So, registry done, classification done, name blank. The cursor blinked in the name field. It had been blinking for 3 days. Deka leaned back in the chair, the one she'd adjusted on day 2, by jamming a folded nutrient slab wrapper behind the lumbar support, because Combine ergonomics were designed for a species with a different spine, and she was not going to spend 6 months with her lower back screaming at her. And looked at the field. A name. She could pick one. She could pick anything. The system didn't care. It was a text field with a 40-character limit and no validation logic. She could type "burn the Combine" and the transponder would broadcast it faithfully into the void, and every automated relay station would log it without comment, because automated relay stations did not have opinions. But she didn't want to pick one alone. She'd been making unilateral decisions for 8 days, and nobody had objected, mostly because she was the only one who could read the displays. But this one felt different. This wasn't an engineering decision. This wasn't which valve do I open, or what frequency do I broadcast on, or how do I make the nutrient synthesizer produce something that doesn't taste like compressed sadness. This was identity, and she'd learned in her 26 years on Earth and her 8 days in space that you don't build identity alone. You build it in committee, badly, with arguments. And the result is always worse than what any individual would have chosen and better than what any individual deserves. She reached for the bridge intercom. The Naniche tossed. It was 0300. People were sleeping. Some of them had not slept well in 8 days and were only now beginning to close their eyes without one hand on a weapon. Waking them up to ask what to call the ship was, she thought about the woman from the Comanche Plains, how the tracker had spent the first 2 nights sleeping in a crouch against the bulkhead, one hand flat on the deck as if reading vibrations through the metal. She thought about the strategist who slept the way he did everything, economically, in controlled intervals, waking without transition as if sleep were a duty shift he'd completed. She thought about the big Norse one, who didn't sleep so much as hold still for a few hours before getting up to check the corridor outside whatever compartment he'd claimed, pacing its length like a wolf circling a den before lying down again. They needed sleep, all of them did. She pressed the intercom anyway. What should we call the ship? Her voice came out flatter than she'd intended, the 0300 energy stripping the question of ceremony. I'm doing the transponder now and I need a name. The intercom crackled. Cillians. She imagined the sound reaching through the corridors, into the sleeping quarters they'd carved out of former containment bays, into the maintenance alcoves where some of the freed humans still preferred to sleep because the alcoves were small and enclosed and felt safer than open space. The intercom speakers were everywhere. The Combine had designed them for ship-wide announcements about cargo handling procedures, not for midnight polls about nomenclature, and the sound of her voice would have reached every inhabited section of the ship, bouncing off the bare metal walls and into whatever fragile architecture of rest 600 people had managed to build for themselves. She added, because she did feel slightly guilty. I know it's early, or late. Take your time. More silence. The bridge hummed around her. She could hear the soft tick of the thermal regulation system in the overhead, and beyond it, the deeper resonance of the reactor. Not a sound, exactly, but a presence, the way you could feel a large engine idling in a building, even when it was 4 floors below you. The ship was alive in the way machines are alive, persistent, full of processes that continued whether or not anyone was watching. Then a voice came through, deep, rough, speaking in a language she didn't understand but had learned to recognize by its cadence. Norse. The big one, the one who had broken the first cell with his bare hands and had not, as far as she could tell, slept for more than 4 hours at a stretch since. The words were short, a compound from the sound of it, two syllables jammed together with the force of a fist hitting a table. He sounded groggy. He also sounded like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She'd heard him use it when he talked about things that had tried to stop him and hadn't succeeded. There was a pride in it that had nothing to do with boasting, factual pride, stated flatly, the way you'd say the river is deep or the winter was long. Something that means it did not stop when it should have. She wrote it down. She couldn't spell it, so she wrote a phonetic approximation and the meaning she'd read from his voice. She used the engineering stylus on the secondary display, the one she'd been using for her star annotations. The letters were blocky. They looked like they belonged on the wall of a cave. The next voice came faster. Latin, clean clipped, dry in a way that made everything sound considered, weighed, and found adequate. The tall commander. He gave her a phrase, not a single word, 3 syllables, maybe 4, with the cadence of a place name. She heard it and knew, without understanding the language, that it was somewhere he'd been, somewhere he'd returned from, when the odds said he shouldn't have. The way he said it, unhurried, but precise, as if the name were being placed on a surface rather than tossed, told her it was a word he'd carried for a long time. A word that had been in his mouth before she asked. She wrote that down too. A longer pause, then a voice she recognized by its silence before the words arrived. The tracker. When the tracker spoke, there was always a space before, as if she were checking the wind direction of the conversation before committing. The language was Comanche, and the word was longer than she'd expected, with a rolling middle syllable that sounded like open ground, like the word itself was a landscape, flat and wide with something moving across it. She couldn't parse the meaning directly, but the tracker's voice carried dark humor, the sound of someone describing a path you wouldn't choose if you had options, but you didn't have options, so you took it, and it turned out to be the right one anyway. The path that goes where the horse doesn't want to go. She wrote it. The display was filling up. 6 words from 6 languages, none of them agreeing, all of them arguing for the same thing from different directions. The engineering stylus left faint trails on the display surface between entries, ghost lines from her hand moving, and she didn't wipe them. They looked like connections. They looked like the map she was building of the sky, provisional, incomplete, hers. The next voice came in a register that was precise and carried the weight of an offering rather than a suggestion. The strategist. His word was Japanese, or something older than what she thought of as Japanese, from a century in a dialect she couldn't place. It was short, 2 syllables. It had the quality of a name, a proper noun, a clan name, she thought, something specific, something that belonged to someone who was gone, his way of carrying it forward. She wrote it down and felt the weight of it on the display. That one wasn't a suggestion, it was a gift. The difference was in the silence after, the way the intercom held nothing for a long moment, as if he'd said what he had to say, and the channel itself understood that no follow-up was required. Then, and she knew this voice before the first syllable resolved, because this voice was always awake at 0300, because this voice did not sleep heavily, because this voice had spent a lifetime listening through walls and doors and the thin barriers between safety and its absence. Then, the word we use for the road when you have been on it so long you have stopped thinking about the destination, the Romani woman said. Her voice was warm and measured and came through the intercom, like it had been waiting in the circuit for exactly this moment. Just the road, just moving. The word she gave was Romani. It was beautiful. It sounded like something you'd say to yourself on the 3rd day of walking, when your feet had stopped complaining and your body had accepted that forward was the only available direction, and the road had become so familiar it was no longer a road. It was just the shape your life was making. Deka wrote it down. Her throat was tight. She didn't know why. It was 0300, and she was writing words on the display, and none of this was supposed to be emotional. She was doing a transponder change. It was an administrative task. She was a systems engineer performing a routine registry update on a stolen alien freight vessel, and the fact that her eyes were stinging was probably the sodium orange lighting, which was not designed for human eyes and had been giving her low-grade headaches since day one. That was definitely what it was, the lighting. The last voice came in Nawatla. She knew it was the last because she'd been counting, and she knew it was him because his voice carried that unhurried, ceremonial quality, as if every word he spoke was being said for the first time and also the last time, and both of those things were the same thing. It did not preface the word. It did not explain it. He spoke it the way you place a stone on a cairn, deliberately, with the understanding that it would remain. The word he gave was a color, or a time, or both. Nahuatl didn't separate them the way her languages did. It was the word for a specific quality of morning light, the kind that came before the world knew the sun was rising, when the sky held itself between dark and bright and everything was possible because nothing had been decided yet. She wrote it down. 6 answers, 6 languages. None of them agree. All of them are right. I am going to make something that is made of all of them and belongs to none of them. She looked at the display, 6 words in 6 scripts, transliterated into the blocky letters of her phonetic approximation. She read them again. She read them a 3rd time. She said them out loud, quietly, one after another, listening to the sounds they made in her mouth, the hard Norse compound, the clean Latin phrase, the rolling Comanche, the precise Japanese, the warm Romani, the luminous Nahuatl. Each one sat in a different part of her jaw, her tongue, her teeth. The Norse was all consonants and force. The Romani was vowels and forward motion. The Nahuatl sat high behind her front teeth, like light. That is also an accurate description of this ship. She started working. She'd done too much thinking in 8 days, and it had gotten her exactly as far as sitting alone at 0300 with a blank field and a blinking cursor. She let her ear do it instead. She took the opening consonant cluster from the strategist's clan name, the sound that carried the weight of something preserved past its expected ending. She took the middle vowel from the Romani road word, the open, moving sound, the sound of a foot still falling. She took a closing syllable that blended the Norse hardness with something softer, something that didn't exist in any of the 6 languages, but existed in the space between them. She wrote it out, looked at it, said it, Arveth. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything in any language that had ever been spoken on Earth or anywhere else. It was a synthesis, a word made by someone who knew 6 words and belonged to none of them, built from pieces that each carried a meaning she could feel but not translate. It sounded like a name. It sounded like it had always been a name, and she'd just found it, the way you find a stone on a beach that fits exactly in your palm and realize you'd been walking with your hand open for a reason. She typed it into the field. The display asked for confirmation. She confirmed. The transponder system, the same mature, stagnant, idiot-proof combine technology that had been broadcasting the ship's old identity since before she was born, accepted the new name without comment. No validation error, no flag, no query. The system did not care what the ship was called. It was a text field. It took the text. The broadcast updated. She watched the confirmation pulse go out, a tight beam packet, to the nearest relay, which would log it and propagate it forward, and from there it would ripple outward through the Combine's automated navigation network at the speed of light plus, reaching station after station, each one dutifully updating its local database with a new entry, independent trader Arvith, no prior record, no flag, no file. The Combine doesn't have this name. No database on any Combine station will return a record for it. We are, for the first time, something they have no file on. The weight of that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. For 8 days they had been a stolen Combine ship, broadcasting a Combine identity, running on Combine fuel, eating Combine food, breathing Combine air. For 8 days they had been a line item in someone's recovery manifest, a freight anomaly, a procedural irregularity, cargo that had become non-compliant. The Combine's language, for what they were, had been the only language available because it was the only language the ship spoke. Not anymore. The ship spoke their language now, or rather it spoke a language that didn't exist until 60 seconds ago, a language made of 6 words from 6 worlds by a woman sitting alone at an engineering station at 0300 because she'd understood, in the way that comes from being pulled out of one life and dropped into another, that the most dangerous thing you can be in a universe run by people who file everything is something that has never been filed. She leaned back in the adjusted chair. The lumbar support crinkled, the nutrient slab wrapper shifting under her weight, making the sound of compressed foil that she had heard so many times now it had become part of the bridge's ambient signature, as familiar as the reactor hum or the thermal exchanger's warble. The bridge was quiet. The displays glowed their steady sodium orange, the Combine's industrial palette, the only light she'd known for 8 days. Somewhere behind her, in the corridors and converted bays and maintenance alcoves, 600 people were sleeping. Some of them had names she knew. Most of them had names she didn't. All of them were on a ship that had, 60 seconds ago, become something new. She pulled up the star chart. The avoided cluster was 2 days ahead, a smudge of 40-odd stars on the chart's edge, marked with Combine avoidance notations and 4 dead-end entry markers that the tracker had read like animal tracks. Ormosealed that none came out. The Combine had looked at that data and decided the rational response was to stop going in. The tracker had looked at the same data and decided the rational response was to go in faster. Deka had spent the last 2 days annotating the chart. He didn't have the data for the full thing, and wouldn't until they were closer, but she'd marked the parts she could see. She'd marked the stars they'd passed. She'd noted the relay stations they'd pinged and the ones they'd avoided. She'd flagged the fuel density readings that suggested a star had harvestable resources, and the magnetic field readings that suggested another one was unstable. She'd written notes to herself in English, practical shorthand from a woman who had spent 3 years writing field reports for NGOs and knew that the difference between useful information and useless information was whether you could find it again at 0300 when you were tired and scared and needed to make a decision. The chart was hers now. She'd overlaid her annotations on their data, and the result was a map that spoke 2 languages, theirs, in the cold geometry of navigation beacons and threat assessments, and hers, in the messy handwriting of someone who was learning the sky 1 star at a time. She looked at it for a long time. 8 days ago, she'd sat at this same station, different chair position, different display configuration, different everything, and looked at a galaxy she didn't know. She'd felt the size of it, like a physical pressure, the way you feel altitude when you climb too fast. And this star was unknown. Every direction was a guess. The Combine's chart had been the only map, and it was a map that didn't include the place she'd come from, because Earth was Tier 7 negligible, and the cartography department hadn't seen a reason to maintain the entry. Now she looked at the same chart, and some of the stars had her writing beside them, a handful. Enough that the chart was no longer entirely alien. It was partly annotated, partly known, partly hers in a way that felt like the difference between standing in a city you've never visited and standing in one where you know the name of one street. One street was enough. One street meant you could find the next one. The fuel readout pulsed gently in the corner of her display, a slow amber heartbeat counting down the reactor's current cycle. She checked it by habit. Nominal. The thermal exchanger warbled once, settled. The life support indicators, the ones she'd recalibrated on day 4 to account for human respiratory needs rather than whatever the Combine's original crew had been breathing, showed green across all inhabited sections. Air was good, temperature was good. Water reclamation was running at 87%, which was not great, but was better than the 71% she'd inherited and miles better than the 53% that would trigger the emergency protocols she'd spent an entire afternoon learning how to override. But the ship was running, The ship was hers, the ship was theirs, and in 2 days it would reach the edge of a cluster of stars that the largest bureaucratic empire in this arm of the galaxy had decided to avoid, and what they found there would be, she didn't know. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. None of them did. But the ship had a name, and the name was broadcasting. And the name was made of 6 words from 6 worlds, and belonged to none of them and all of them. And that was exactly what they were, a thing that had never been filed, heading toward a place that had never been mapped, crewed by people who had never been meant to meet. Deka adjusted the lumbar support one more time. The wrapper crinkled up. She pulled up her annotation layer and added a new note beside the avoided cluster. 2 days, bring everybody. Then she settled in to read the stars. Behind her, the ship breathed. The corridors hummed their steady frequency. 600 people slept in various states of having survived, something scattered through converted containment bays and maintenance alcoves and the warm spaces between bulkheads where the reactor's heat bled through the walls. Some of them dreamed, some of them didn't. All of them were carried forward through a sky that was no longer entirely unknown, on a heading that was no longer a flight, but a direction, in a ship that had a name. The transponder pulsed. The Arveth, independent trader, no prior record, no flag, no file, announced itself to the void. The void received the announcement without comment, the way it received everything, and the signal propagated outward through the combi's automated relay network, station by station, each one logging the entry and moving on, because automated relay stations did not have opinions, and the name Arveth meant nothing to them, and nothing to anyone, and nothing to any system, in any database anywhere. Which was exactly the point. The stars moved, the ship moved, the woman at the navigation console watched them both, annotating as she went, learning the sky one mark at a time. She was looking at a chart she was building. That was everything, 8 days and 600 lives, and a transponder change at 0300, and 6 words in 6 languages, and a name that had never existed before she typed it. The Arveth flew on. Deka read the stars.